Well, good morning.
Good morning.
How good are you at following directions? Are you good at following directions? Yeah? Well, you know what? It's important to follow directions. And I'm going to tell you a story that happened 3 weeks ago tonight. And I had a pair of bull calves that I was going to train for oxen. And I said I had them, I sold them. They were too much for right now. A lot going on, and too much to take care of, and I wasn't getting enough training in on them. But I was getting some training. I was training them, and what you use is a stick called a goad stick. And it's not used to beat the animal or hurt them. You touch them with it to get them to move in certain directions. Now, if I wanted them to turn to the left, I would touch their right shoulder, and I would tell them to ha, and they would turn to the left. And if I wanted them to turn to the right, I would touch them on their left shoulder and say G, and they would take and turn to the right. And if I wanted them to come forward, I would touch their hind side and say come up. Or if I wanted them to back up, I would just tap them on the knee and tell them to back. And if I wanted to tell them no, just to stop, I would touch their nose or on their forehead with it and say, whoa. Well, I would be bringing them in at night, and I would go out and I would holler, come on, boys. And they'd run up to the gate, and I'd put their halters on them, and I would tie them to the gate, and then I would take one in at a time. And so I tied up one, and then the other one was standing there, and I went to get him, put his halter on him, and he decided to take off. He decided he was going to go down the other end of the paddock that I had him in. And I'm like, you little brat. You know? And it's like, I'm tired. I don't want to be chasing you. And I went down, and I had my goat stick in my hand. And he came, and he stopped, and then he started going away again, and then he stopped again, and he turned around and looked at me, and I reached out with my goat stick, and I didn't have the halter on him to direct him or anything. I reached out and I touched his nose, and I said, whoa. And he stopped, and I stood beside him like I would normally. And I didn't have a halter on him, and I reached out, and I touched his hindsides with it, and I said, Zadok, come up. And he walked right along with me. And I brought him up. I wanted to bring him in next to his brother at the gate. So I brought him right up, and I reached out, and I touched his right shoulder with the goat stick, and I said, ha. And he turned right next to his brother, put the goat stick in front of his nose, said, whoa. And he stopped. I put his halter on him, and I tied him. It's like, wow, he has been learning. You know? It's important to listen to directions, but it's also important to listen to who's giving you the directions. You know, God has given us many directions. We have a whole book of His directions, don't we? We have the Bible that tells us all the wonderful things that He wants us to do and what He's done for us. But He says, listen to me. You know, He says that He's the shepherd. And in John 10 it says, my sheep hear my what? My voice, and they follow me. Huh. So is it important to follow Jesus? Is it important to listen to what he's saying to us? Yeah. So we all need more work on learning how to follow directions. I know I do. I need more work on that. But you know what? God is training us to follow him and to listen carefully to him and do what he says. So before we go back to our seats, let's fold our hands, excuse me, and have a prayer. Dear Jesus, we just want to thank you so much that you love us and that you want the very best for us, and you're training us to follow you. And Lord, help us to learn to listen and also to follow your directions, and that we will go where you call us to go, where you want us to be, and to become what you want us to become. We just thank you and praise you for hearing our prayers, because we ask it in your precious name. Amen. You may go back to your seats now.
This morning's scripture reading comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 9 through 11, and I'll be reading from the New American Standard Version. Once again, to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 9 through 11. In addition to being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, and he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. The words of the wise are like goads, and masters of these collections are like driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. We ask a blessing on the Lord's word, and Brother Dan as he brings us the message this morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Words. We all use them. Sometimes we use them for good, sometimes we use them for bad. The question is, how do we use them? And how should we use them? In the passage that Jay just read, I'm going to go over that again. And it says, moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. And the preacher sought to find acceptable words. And what was written was upright, words of truth. Words of the wise are like goads. You know, in children's story I talked about the goad stick. That goad stick is used for direction. It's not used to beat. I mean, some people try using it for that, but that's not really what it's for. It actually gets to the point that when you're working a pair of cattle, that the stick doesn't even touch the animal. You move the stick, and they associate it with the word that you're using. If you want them to turn to the right, you say G, and they're going to go that way. You don't have to touch them. You know, when I was teaching the calves how to back up, sometimes I would tap their knees if they weren't listening. But a lot of times, instead of tapping the knees, I would tap the ground in front of their front feet. And they would back up. So the stick wasn't even used to touch them. And it got to the point that most of the time I wouldn't have to take and touch their nose when I wanted them to stop. Unless they were being real rambunctious, I would just hold the stick in front of them. And they would stop. So he's saying here that The words of the wise are like goads. They're used to instruct. They're used to give direction. And the words of a scholar are like a well-driven nail. What does a well-driven nail do? It holds something together, right? So he's saying that the words of the wise are like instruction, and the words of scholars are like something that holds things together. Given by one shepherd. One that's leading the flock. So this is how words are to be used. You know, we have a paper that's been on our refrigerator. It's actually been on a number of refrigerators because our refrigerators have died over the years. And it just gets put on the refrigerator again. And it was when our kids were little. And it says, think before you speak. And think is an acronym. And the T is thoughtful. Is it thoughtful? H is it honest? I, is it inspiring? N, is it necessary? And K, is it kind? So before you speak, is what you're saying, is it thoughtful? Is it honest? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And I think we have it on there to remind ourselves it. And maybe we don't follow it as much as we should. But it's there. That's how we should be using words. And another thing that we used to tell our kids, there's a little old saying that says, if truthful I will be, my words must all agree with the facts exactly. How many times do we twist it just a little bit to make ourselves look good? Or, I don't want to get in trouble, so we used to call it playing lawyer. When the kids would like, well, you know, no, that didn't happen. Well, the reason they said it didn't happen because one word got changed. And it might have been a word that didn't really matter. But that wasn't the exact thing. You know, we try to justify ourselves with our words also. So, how do we use our words? Let's turn to James chapter 3. You know, before I get into this, there's a couple other little things I want to share. I'm the youngest of 5 kids, you know, and one of my older brothers used to tell me on a regular basis, Dan, it's better to keep your mouth shut and let people think you're stupid than opening your mouth and removing all doubt. You know, that was kind of a little dig, you know. And the other thing is, he says, if you get the mouth, you better have the muscle to back it up. How we use our words. You know, I didn't really care for either one of those sayings growing up. You know, sometimes it's true, though, that it's better to keep your mouth shut. And you better be able to back up what you're saying. Maybe not with muscle, but with the truth, to back it up with truth. Now let's go to James chapter 3. And we're going to go verses 1 to 12. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Let's stop there for a minute. I don't know if any of you have had experiences with horses. But, you know, you can take a big horse and put a little piece of metal in their mouth and control them. And it's all in how you do it. There's two different things. It's called a soft mouth or a hard mouth. And hard mouth animals are normally created because the person that's training them is very tough on the bit. Yanks on it a lot. You don't have to be yanking hard on a bit. There's some stubborn horses, yeah, you need a little heavier bit. But for the most part, you can train a horse to be soft-mouthed. And they get used to who's handling the lines. A friend of mine, well, an acquaintance of mine, let's say, came and helped me one day. I was logging with my old stallion that I still have. He was young at that time, and I was logging a lot. And this guy, he was a very good teamster with animals, with horses. He'd worked horses for years. And he was driving my stallion. And I'm watching this horse. I was using the chainsaw, I was cutting logs, and he was twitching them out with the horse for me. And I'm watching the horse. The horse wasn't doing anything wrong, but he wasn't doing everything right either. He wasn't just his normal go all out horse that he was. And I'm watching it, and he's just not doing his best. He's just kind of plodding. He's not. What is going on with him today? So I finished cutting some logs, and I was standing next to the trail, and I reached out in front of this other guy. I reached out and I grabbed the lines. And this other guy, I never said a word. I just reached out, grabbed the lines, and Dick let go of the lines. And as soon as I grabbed the lines, that horse stepped right up and did what he always did. Just the way Dick was holding the lines was totally different than the way that I handled them. And as soon as my hands hit those lines and took them over, that horse knew it was me, not somebody else. And not only is it because his hands handled the lines a little bit different than mine, but the horse and I had a relationship. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Just a little movement of our hands can take and turn that horse no matter which way we want it to go. Also, look also at ships. They are so large and are driven by fierce winds, and they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea, is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It's an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter water from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus, no spring yields both salt water and fresh. So, how do we use our tongues? Do we both bless God and curse men? We all do it. Some of us more than others. And it says here, no man can tame the tongue. Who can tame our tongue? Only God can. It's like putting the bit in the horse's mouth. It controls the animal. And God's wanting to put a bit in our mouths to control our tongue. And when we have a relationship with Him, when He grabs a hold of the lines, we know it's Him. Just like that stallion knew that it was my hands on the lines. He and I had a relationship. I got him when he was just after he was weaned. So that was, I'm trying to remember, somewhere between 4 and 6 months. And he and I had worked together for years. And, at that time he was probably 6, 7 years old. So he and I had a relationship. Well, that's what we need to have with God, so He can control our tongues. We need to take and give our tongues to Him. And just like on a ship, I don't know if anyone has done any sailing, it doesn't take much if you're holding the tiller on a sailboat and it moves the rudder just a little bit. It can move that boat quite a distance around. But that's how God wants to direct us. Even though we're driven by fierce winds, He wants to control us. And it's only through His grace that we can control our tongues. We're going to look at a bunch of verses. We're going to go to the book of Proverbs. And we're going to start in Proverbs chapter 7. And verse 24. And it says, "Now therefore listen to me, my children. Pay attention to the words of my mouth. This is a father speaking to his children. He says, pay attention. Listen. Listen to the words of my mouth. Let's go to Proverbs 15. In verse 23, a man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season. How good it is. You ever somebody come up to you and say something that, you're feeling down that day, and they come up and they give you some words of encouragement, and how good that feels? That one of those days that, everything has gone wrong, and somebody comes up and says, hey, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Or, you know what? I was just watching you. You handled that situation pretty good. And you felt like you're just feeling frustrated. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, maybe I'm looking at things wrong here. A word spoken in due season, how good it is. Let's go to chapter 12. In verse 25, anxiety in the heart of a man causes depression, but a good word makes it glad. How many people here have ever felt anxiety? And it does cause depression, doesn't it? You ever get really anxious about something? Yesterday was one of those days. It started a couple days before, but yesterday I was doing a job that I didn't really want to do in the first place, because I had given up doing roofs years ago because it's hard on the body. It really is. And there's this one customer that's kept pushing about doing this roof. And I stripped a section of it. It's white cedar shingle roof. Got to take the old shingles off. And I got a section of it stripped, and I started putting some on the day before. And I got off that roof after being on it for 3.5 hours, just 3.5 hours in the afternoon. And I felt so crippled up. And it was 2 days in a row that I'd been on that roof. And then I had to drive home for 40 minutes, and just sitting in the car, it made it even worse. And I'm like, oh, I can't do this. Physically, I can't do it. The hard part is, it's like, you know what? You're not getting any younger. You can't do this stuff. And they're coming to grips with that, too. It's just, almost 50 years of carpentry kind of takes a toll on the body. And I'm like, I can't do this. I literally physically cannot do this job. So yesterday when I got there, I said to the customers, I said, look, we need a crew, not just me, to do this roof. And she says, do you have someone in mind? I said, yeah, my son said he was willing to do it. I says, I physically cannot do this anymore. And her husband had just had 2 knee replacement operations. And I said something about my knees just aren't holding up to this. Well, fortunately, he had 2 knee operations, and she's seen him recover over the last couple of months. And she was like, oh, I understand. I was like, whew. That word that she said, I understand, I've been watching him. Let's try to get something else here. It just took all the anxiety away. a good word makes it glad. You know, I slept better last night. You know? Let's go to Proverbs 25. And verse 11. A word fitly spoken are like apples of gold in settings of silver. What's gold and silver? Precious metals, right? And it says a word fitly spoken are like apples of gold in settings of silver. It's precious. It's valuable. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 30, verse 5. Every word of God is pure. He is a shield to those who put their trust in him. So we've been going over what people say, but now we're looking at what God says. And what does it say about God's words? They're pure. And not only they're pure, and he is a shield to those who put their trust in him. If we are followers of God, and we try to emulate him, how should our words be? They should be pure. I know I've got work to do. This sermon is for me. And when we look at that, if we go to Proverbs 21, verse 23, it gives us another thing to think about. It says, whoever guards his mouth and his tongue keeps his soul from troubles. Whoever guards his mouth. How do we guard our mouth and tongues? By giving them to God. It says that he is a shield to those who put their trust in him. Now we're going to go to Psalms. We're going to go to Psalms 19. And verse 14, David praying, he says, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. The things that are in our hearts normally come out through our mouths, don't they? And he says, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. He's the one that gives us the strength to have the pure words, to control our tongues. Now let's go to Psalms 119. in verse 103. It's talking about God's words. It says, "How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth." So God's words are sweet. We should take those words and just devour them and put them into our lives. So what comes into that they become part of our heart, and what comes from the heart comes out of the mouth. Now let's go to John chapter 10. We'll look at the first 5 verses. "Most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." God's words. The shepherd, Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep. His sheep know his voice. They listen to his words. And they follow him. Why? Because they have a relationship with him. They know him. I want to tell another little story. When I was younger, my early 20s, I used to run and do, the citizen road races. And I had been running at this track because I had strained my hip. And when I was running there was this guy that was coaching some other people. And he was watching me run, and he says, and he told me he knew watched how I was running, and he says, "Oh, you're running on crowned roads, so your hip you got a hip hike," and he says, "That's what's causing that." He knew it by watching. And he says, "We meet here a couple times a week. Come and I'll coach you." And he just did it because he liked doing it. He had been a runner when he was younger. He was an older man. He had been a captain on a ship. And one night when he was walking the deck, somebody had left a hatch open and he fell through, broke his back, and he ended up in a wheelchair. But he would take and coach people on running because he had run for years. And so so he was coaching. I would meet with them a couple times a week. There was 3 of us that were running there that he was coaching. And there was a race, and this was down in Amesbury, Mass. And there was a race that one night. It was 91 degrees out when we started the race. It was a 7.2 mile race, not a 6. I don't know why they came up with 7.2. It was normally a 10K is 6.2, but they added a mile to it. And we were supposed to start and stop at the same place, but come to find out, they had advertised it as 7.2, and when somebody realized that they were 0.2 of a mile short where the finish line was, so they moved the finish line. like I said, it was 91 and it's hot and you're trying to finish the race and you got people right on your tail trying to pass you and you're saying, I'm not going to let anyone pass me. It's this close. And we get to where everyone thought the end of the race was, and it's not there. You have to go 0.2 of a mile more. And you put everything into it thinking you're going to end there, and you got 0.2 of a mile. And you're already hot and tired. And at the ends of these races, there's all sorts of people cheering you on. And there's just this, it's noisy. And, you're trying to figure out what's going on and all this screaming. Well, the coach, Pat, he was sitting about 0.1 of a mile from the end of the race. He's sitting in his wheelchair next to the road. And in all this screaming, I hear his voice. He didn't holler. He just spoke. He says, "Pick it up, Dan. You're almost there." Out of all, our closing song today is 359, "Hark the Voice of Jesus Calling." benediction today is taken from Psalms 19,